But today we have actually two speakers and a third who is going to be involved with the program and introducing our speakers. So I'm going to hand it off to Caleb right now from the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and we really appreciate the invite to come and talk about this project that we've been engaged in since 2020. Talk about a few results, and we think it's a project that really has a chance to hopefully produce some results down the line with improving our understanding of how birds interact with marine debris and maybe a few things that we can actually do about it as a conservation community. And I also want to thank everyone who has showed up for your time today at the lunch hour to come and learn a little bit more. I'm going to share my screen here, and please tell me if you guys can see it. Let's see, there we go. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you. So yeah, like I am Caleb Spiegel, like Suzanne was saying. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Program, and I'm a seabird biologist in the program, even though I sit in our regional office, which is nowhere near the ocean. It's in Western Massachusetts near Amherst. But I do think a lot about seabirds and shorebirds and what the different threats are and how we can address some of those threats. And so today I'm going to be talking about one of the threats that's really emerging for the Fish and Wildlife Service program and a lot of partners. We're trying to understand it a little bit better in our region, and we're also, trying to get people more involved in cooperating on some issues that actually affect birds and marine debris. And so, but the first thing that I really want to do, it's my honor to introduce the project leads of this project, who really have done the lion's share of the work and will be doing most of the presentation. The first one is Meg Harrington, and Meg is a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She works throughout New England and focuses on the conservation of threatened and endangered species, with a special interest in shorebirds and the impacts of marine debris on our coasts. Meg received a master's in environmental conservation from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 2021, and a bachelor's of science in conservation biology from St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. And before grad school, Meg was a field biologist for many years, and her favorite jobs included monitoring common loons in New Hampshire and working with snowy plovers in California. She also propagated native plants for coastal bluff restoration and conducted wildlife surveys in the high desert. And she's coordinated this marine debris project since the fall and is new to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're really lucky to have her on now as a permanent employee. So she'll be talking, I guess, third after me and Michael. But Michael, I wanted to introduce also. He's currently the program supervisor, Michael Andranovich, with the AmeriCorps Cape Cod program. And he oversees a team-based service projects and provides support and member training and volunteer engagement activities. So he coordinates that program there in Cape Cod. He received a Master's of Environmental Science and Management from the University of Rhode Island in 2021 with a concentration in conservation biology. And he worked on this marine debris project as part of his program, which is really lucky for us that we got a lot of his time. Previously, Michael obtained a bachelor's in science and environmental studies with a minor in computer science from St. John's University in Queens, New York. And prior to graduate school, Michael completed a year of service with the AmeriCorps Cape Cod program and pursued positions in environmental education and wildlife stewardship and research assistance. And he really wants to, pursue conservation impact at the local level and try and get people engaged. So this project has been really good for working with Michael working on it. So Michael partnered with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Noaa Marine Debris Program to initiate the Marine Debris Project in the spring of 2020. And while on the project, he produced a report that you're going to hear about first in our talk in order to help policymakers and the public understand the impacts of marine debris. And so I'm going to just kick us off a little bit, but it's, I wanted to give Meg and Michael the recognition that they deserve. It's really, really cool to see a new generation of biologists that are, doing such good work. conservationists, and I'm proud to get to say that I've gotten to work with them. So just a little bit about the project background, and then I just want to let people know there will be time for questions at the end. So don't worry when you jot your question down, and we can get to it at the end. So marine debris is widely recognized as a threat to coastal and marine wildlife. We know that from a number of research studies and also some anecdotal evidence from different parts of the world. And for birds, there's a number of impacts that are also known about, entanglement and entrapment being a major one. You see pictures of birds wrapped around with different kinds of marine debris and fishing line. They also ingest different kinds of debris, especially both macro and microplastics that can affect their health and even cause starvation. And then this debris is washing up in their habitats, and so it's degrading nests and breeding colonies. So those are some of the main impacts that we know about. But in the Gulf of Maine, really very little research had been done, at least. And there was a lot of anecdotal sorts of reporting that there were interactions, but no one had really taken a look at birds and tried to pull together information to better understand how marine debris was impacting birds in this area. And I should mention that we define the Gulf of Maine broadly, basically from the Bay of Fundy down to northern Cape Cod. So it's a pretty large area, not just off the coast of Maine. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service really got interested in this project, again, because I'm a seabird biologist, and we're trying to better understand different threats to seabirds. Worldwide, they are declining substantially. We've lost about 70% of their population since the 1950s. So it's definitely concerning, and this is just reflective of a larger downward trend in birds as a whole. We know that in North America, 3 billion birds have been lost since the 1970s, and so we're really concerned about all the different types of threats, especially the ones that we don't know the full impact of. And marine debris is really one of them. And so what we aim to do is team up with the Noaa Marine Debris Program, who came up with this Gulf of Maine Marine Debris Action Plan in 2019 with dozens of partners. And this includes partners that are not just wildlife folks, they are thinking about marine debris. So the idea was to pull people together with bird and wildlife background and try and get some of the overarching themes that would affect birds and also impact folks that are trying to learn about marine debris and try and clean it up. So we wanted to compile what was known about the impacts. We wanted to identify information gaps and try and figure out some preliminary strategies for addressing impacts. And I should mention that this work was, again, recommended in the Noaa coordinated Gulf of Maine Marine Debris Action Plan, and it directly supported plan objectives. So I'm going to now hand it off to Michael Andranovich, who I introduced earlier, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about this project and what we did.
Thank you, Caleb. And again, I echo Caleb's sentiments. Thank you, everybody who came to come listen this afternoon. This is a project that means a lot to me. It means a lot to Meg, means a lot to Caleb. And hopefully by the end of it, everybody can understand the impacts that it'll have on our future and some of this research we did. So this project was really broken up into 3 phases. But I should state that when it first started, it was just this idea out of the Noaa Marine Debris Action Plan. And the real idea was just gather information first, right? So that's this phase 1 that we're talking about. So that came as a result directly out of the Marine Debris Action Plan. I linked up with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Noaa Marine Debris Program as a research assistant, and they tasked me with gathering as much information on interactions with marine debris and birds that I could find. So that was just to produce a report, right? We were going to have all of this unpublished literature, published literature, anything we could find. And as I was going through it, we realized that there wasn't a lot of things published on this topic, right? It was a topic that it's sort of new, it's been around for a long time, but not a lot of hardcore science research has been done about it. So as we're gathering it together, this phase 2 kind of begins to form. And that's out of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Instead of just exposing people to this little bit of high level research that I could find, why not turn this into what we called an implementation framework, right? So it became not just a document with information in it, but then a framework, secondly, that could kind of step down these action steps based on priorities that were identified from different partners, as Caleb talked about, stakeholders, policymakers, bird people, plastic people. We tried to get as many voices in the room that usually aren't together. And we really wanted to create a document that they could use and really work step by step, as opposed to just giving them this grand idea of, oh, we know plastic is a problem, or we know marine debris is a problem with birds, go figure it out, right? So by breaking this down into tangible action steps, you really get a better job and a better set of results. And currently we're in phase 3. That's the phase that Megan's going to talk about after my slides. That's what do you do with this information, right? We didn't want to just create a document that some people might read, the general public may not have interest in. We didn't want to just create this implementation framework that policymakers and stakeholders will use. We wanted to implement it, right? We wanted to kick off and get the ball rolling so that everyone, including members of the public, like everybody here today, could figure out where they fit into this system, right? We want to make sure that everybody understands that there's a role to play, like most conservation environmental problems. So it's just a couple of objectives we wanted to get out of the way with phase 1 and phase 2. We wanted to compile all the information. We wanted to work with different partners. We wanted to identify, the biggest strategies to accomplish, to overcome this problem. We wanted to identify the biggest information gaps. And we really wanted to start presenting this to people, right? Not just to U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Noaa, but to anybody and anybody who would listen. So as Caleb put up here, this document turned into a report, or this report and implementation framework turned into a document. This document was released in I guess, February of 2022. It had been worked on since, as Caleb said, the spring of 2020, which was a 2-year project. During that time, it was all the COVID pandemic had an impact. So I was talking with Suzanne before the presentation. I've actually never met Caleb. Me and Caleb have worked on this project for 2 straight years. And because of COVID, we've never met in person, but it just shows you that the flexibility and adaptation of all these different outlets really helped create something cool. So as we were creating this document and this framework, again, we wanted to make it the most helpful it could be to both researchers, stakeholders, policymakers, the public, children, adults, right? Really no age group. We wanted to make sure that anybody could kind of flip through this and there was a piece of information for somebody. So we completed a webinar series to get to the framework. We summarized everything, and we wanted to make sure that the document was perfect before we released it. And just one last note on how this project continues, even after me, even after Meg. We wanted to make sure that it could be centrally located so that anybody could continue this project and pick it up where we left off, right? Me and Meg and Caleb all know that this project and this problem is going to long outlive everybody here. So by creating a document that can kind of age, I don't want to say beautifully, but be centrally located, be hosted publicly, make sure that everybody can really sink their teeth into it. So we'll talk a little bit about the document now on the next slide. So again, it was broken up into 2 main sections. The first section is the report. That's the section that took approximately 9 months. It was all literature-based. I would say during my time, I read, at this point, the tally is probably well over 130 papers. Just trying to pull as much information as I could. And these papers are technical reports, they're documents, they're gray literature, right? And they're from all different sources like Google, and they're from ResearchGate, they're from Science Direct. These are all publications that used to be found, in library books and journals that can now be found online. So we spent a lot of time reading. And again, we found that there wasn't a lot of published material, right? For every, maybe 10 papers I found about marine debris, maybe 1 was region specific or about a species that could be linked to the Gulf of Maine. So we had to really overcome that information gap, that there just wasn't that much published or that much research going on, in that Cape Cod, Gulf of Maine, New Hampshire region. So we incorporated information from other geographic areas. We tried to nested across the Atlantic that we knew would frequent the Gulf of Maine too, and you try and fill those gaps to see where we can go with it. Not only did we get our information for the report from literature, we also got it through partner inquiry. So, we worked with over 80 stakeholders, just trying to gather as much anecdotal evidence as we could, right? We know that the information is out there. There's people like Caleb, at different refuges. These people are working on this information, but maybe they didn't get it published. So we worked together to try and collect as much of that as we could as well. So we targeted biologists, non-governmental organizations, seabird managers, marine debris scientists in both the United States and Canada, because as you can see from that map on the first slide, the Gulf of Maine is not just the United States regional issue, right? The waters connect. It's not like all of a sudden it gets to the Canadian border and it just stops and it's only a US problem, right? So it was important to incorporate partners from across the border too. As we collected that information, again, it was a lot of photos, it was a lot of stories, it was some data sets, but that was all information that we could use with their permission to kind of share this story and build on the research a little bit more. The framework, I'm going to talk about a little bit later, so I'm going to skip that right now. But then another really important piece about this document that I was very happy that we added were these appendices, right? So there's 5 appendices at the end. Actually, maybe even more than 5 now. We just kept adding and adding because we realized that although the report flowed nicely and the implementation framework had its own piece, we needed to add these extra charts and tables, which service partners were asking us to add, right? As this project grew, seabird managers really wanted funding sources, or collaborators really wanted to know who else is working on this project, right, if they missed a webinar. So we started putting together these extra tables to kind of tag on at the end. And what's important to understand is that these items may have been all created on somebody else's computer somewhere across the Gulf of Maine, but they've never been all collated together. So it was important for us to gather all this information and really put it in one place. And again, that's where you can find some information, not just for people who write policy to reduce plastic, but also a member of the general public can use that and find out where they can look online to understand impact, things like that. So, and most importantly, there'll be a slide about it, was that last bullet point, birds known to be affected by marine debris. That came as a brainchild. One researcher we were working with had kind of been creating her own documentation on that, but we had never, it had never been again put together for just the Gulf of Maine. So we really worked hard to try and identify each seabird and waterfowl, marine waterfowl species we could, with a direct paper link or a direct photo showing the impact of marine debris on that bird. So we can go next slide. All right, so let's get to the good stuff here, right? This is why we're all here. We want to know, yes, it's important that we did the research, but what did we find, right? So what I found during my research is that you can really divide marine debris into 2 prominent parts for the Gulf of Maine. You can define it as derelict fishing gear, which can be defined as fishing gear that is accidentally lost at sea. Some reasons it may be lost at sea or purposely dropped at sea. Could be gear conflict, right? So that's when 2 nets or 2 pots rub together. It causes the line to chafe, and thus the gear is left floating around the bottom. It can be misplaced or poorly placed, right? So a fishing boat may place it somewhere where in the past they had success catching lobster, crab, or fish. And all of a sudden the bottom, the benthic layer changes and there's more rocks. Maybe they forget where they placed it. A buoy snaps off. So that gear is lost. It's left at the bottom. Kind of jumping off of that is irregular seafloor topography, right? So obviously we all know that the seafloor is not this flat sandy bottom, right? We're going to have a lot of rocks, especially in the Gulf of Maine, and that can cause line to chafe. Adverse weather, right? We get these summer storms, these winter storms, that can cause the sea to churn up and break that line. And we unfortunately also found that sometimes it was intentionally lost, right? We uncovered some anecdotal evidence of fishermen where or lobstermen who it was more financially sound for them to just cut bait with some line out at sea rather than bring it in. So very small amount, but we had to kind of work with that human element too, right? It's not always just a natural phenomenon when the gear becomes derelict. Just some bullet points on how big fishing gear is in the Gulf of Maine. I mean, we all love our seafood out here. We love to eat lobster. Estimates suggest that in 2018, over 3.3 million lobster traps were deployed in the Gulf of Maine. So that's what gets pulled out and pulled in every year, 3.3 million. Of that number, it was estimated that around 175,000 of those traps are to be lost, right? So that goes back to that derelict number where, you know, maybe we got bad weather, we got chasing line, they were misplaced. And that 175,000 pots does not come without its own financial loss for these fishing, you know, outfits. They estimated about $16 million annually goes into replacing these pots, these lines, these buoys every year. On top of traditional fishing gear, we think like crab and lobster. Meg's going to talk a little bit more about it, but aquaculture is a growing industry in the Gulf of Maine as well, right? People are growing kelp, they're growing oysters, they're growing quahog, shrimp. It's all being farmed through aquaculture. So a little tidbit on that is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, has declared aquaculture as the fastest growing food production sector in the world, right? So it's not just a Gulf of Maine issue. It's happening all over the world that more people and more farmed seafood is happening. And just to show the impact of that in Maine, it's estimated that the aquaculture industry in Maine was worth about $50 million in 2007, and it nearly tripled to $137 million in 2014. So over 7 years, it tripled, and that number is just continuing to grow, right? So this is an industry that on top of traditional fishing gear needs to be examined, which is an important part of this report. Outside of fishing gear, we have consumer litter, right? So this is something that definitely impacts, I'm sure everyone in this room, if you've ever been to the beach, right? These are cigarette butts, these are plastic bags, these are food containers, these are fast food cups. These are all things that end up on the beach. And a good thing about the Gulf of Maine is that we have beautiful beaches that everybody likes to visit, right? The bad thing about the Gulf of Maine is that we have beautiful beaches that everyone likes to visit. So there's a huge tourist boom that happens, you know, in Cape Cod and New Hampshire and Maine, where people come to visit and they're not always respecting local regulations on litter consumption. There's maybe not enough cans available, receptacles for people, you know, to meet the demand. So we found, yeah, that some reasons that consumer litter can be such a problem is to obviously improper consumer disposal. Faulty recycling management, right? There's always going to be a better way to recycle certain products. And on top of that, we found, and a lot of studies show that there's just too much plastic being used now to manufacture, right? You buy something, it's wrapped in a hard plastic case, wrapped in a small plastic film with a twist tie made of plastic around it. So all of this extra consumer litter can always end up in becoming marine debris if it blows into the ocean. Not only that, obviously, I spoke on it a little bit. We wrote this report in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen some pictures. I've got the picture there from the Ocean Conservancy of a disposable rubber glove in a bird's nest. You know, the having single-use plastic, having single-use PPE, obviously created a large influx of what will potentially be marine debris in the future. So that's something that we touched on a little bit in the report, and we're monitoring for future action. So next slide. All right, so now we know what the debris is, right? We know it's fishing gear, we know it's consumer litter. How is it impacting these birds, right? So the number one reason we think that it's impacting them is this entanglement and entrapment, right? So why does a bird all of a sudden decide to get stuck in a lobster trap, right? I don't think it's a conscious decision they're making. But they could have been foraging for food, right? And if they see a crab or an invertebrate inside of a cage, they'll go in not realizing they can't get out. It could be safety from predators, right? If a diving bird is being followed by a higher level predator, they may duck into some netting and all of a sudden realize they've entangled themselves, they've entrapped themselves. And it could just be sheer number of debris, right? There's a lot of marine debris out there we're finding, and it could just be an unavoidable mistake, right? The birds are foraging, they're going about their business, and they find themselves in a net, or they find themselves in a lobster pot on land, things like that. We found that entanglement occurs both at land and at sea, right? So this can happen on a beach, it can happen out in the middle of the ocean. And one thing to really understand about entanglement is we only know about the birds we can find, right? So it's estimated that because some of these birds, like great shearwaters, very rarely visit land. The numbers we see for entangled birds is actually a very low estimate because you can't record something you can't find, right? So if this is happening deep out at sea, we can only record so much data. A couple of examples I found for the Gulf of Maine, just to bring it locally, is in 2006, a paper came out where they surveyed beaches on Cape Cod, a few different beaches, and they indicated that of the birds they found, over 7% of the birds they had died were either caught in hooks, entangled in fishing lines, things like that. So they did trapped in nets. And then another example they found for more of a land-based, in 2011, they actually found blue jays that had died inside of idle lobster traps, right? So a lobsterman had stored his traps on land. The birds had gone in to, like I said, peck at these invertebrates or maybe leftover food, and they were unable to get out, right? So that was one of the first recorded instances of passerine birds trapped in marine debris on land. Another impact we have is ingestion. This is both primary and secondary, right? So primary being they're eating the plastic, they're eating the cigarette butt that's floating in the air, or that's floating in the sea. The secondary would be brooding their chicks, right? So a seagull or a shearwater might come to its nest. It might provide some food through regurgitation, and that regurgitation may have had plastic in it because the original prey had plastic in it or the bird had consumed it, right? So there's a lot of studies out there, but a really alarming stat is that recent models predict that 99% of all seabird species, including 95% of all individuals, right? So that's 99% of all the species. And then of all those birds that exist, 95% of them will have ingested plastic by 2050. That's a study that came out in 2015, right? So this is just showing that this number is not getting any smaller. Some local examples for Gulf of Maine, some ingestion studies have been conducted both in islands and in the waters of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, and across the border in Canada. One paper that we really enjoyed, and she was a really great partner for us during this, was Anna Roebuck. Her paper was just published last year, but she studied great shearwaters particularly. She necropsied, which is an examination of them after they've died, 217 shearwaters, and found that on average, the birds contained 8 to 10 pieces of plastic, right? So that's per bird. You were already going to find 10 pieces in there, all varying sizes, you know, could be as big as a dime, could be small microplastics, things like that. And one bird she found contained upwards of 200 pieces, which I thought was a very shocking number, that a bird could, one, consume that much plastic, you know. So our last impact would be this degradation of nesting habitats, which can happen a few different ways, right? So this header really encompasses 3 factors. One is incorporation into nests, right? So this is a bird building its nest on a beach or on a rocky island. They're bringing in nesting materials, which is usually sticks, things like that. But unfortunately, they bring some debris in, right? They bring some line they find on the beach. They bring in a Dunkin' Donuts coffee cup, and these things are incorporated into their nest, right? And why that can be an issue is it can increase entanglement, right? If there's a piece of line in there and a chick gets out, it can increase ingestion, right? A baby bird hatches, it's in a nest full of debris, it's going to eat that debris. So incorporation is a big one. And Gulf of Maine example for that is there was a study in the 90s where they examined almost 500 nests of double-crested cormorants. And they found that almost 40% of the nests had some form of debris in them, right? And that's a number that we can probably assume if a similar study was done today would be at least that 40% mark, if not more. Another issue with these nesting habitats is it increases predation, right? So if, again, my example of a Dunkin' Donuts coffee cup is included inside of a nest, a predator like a coyote or a fox or a raccoon may smell that human food, follow the scent, and all of a sudden it's got a nice egg meal. And it can really degrade the nesting area, wipe out a nest. So, you know, the bird does not intentionally include this consumer litter in its nest, but unfortunately it can attract predators. And lastly, it just takes up a lot of space, right? Meg is going to show a few, I don't want to say cool, but really eye-opening pictures of marine debris on Gulf of Maine islands. And it's just, there's just so much of it that birds can't possibly nest around it. It becomes too big of an issue. And then of my 2 pictures here, you can see one example of entanglement and entrapment on the top. And one angle, if you can see, there's two little gull eggs, herring gull eggs inside of that. But obviously the nest is created with line and buoys and pieces of netting. So these are real life examples showing that it's happening right out here. So we can go next slide. Here's a little reference to that appendix with the waterfowl. I wanted to show you that it's not just gulls, right? It's not just blackback gulls that are getting affected by this, right? So that first photo is a red-breasted merganser with a fishing hook wrapped around its bill. That bottom one is a least tern, obviously entrapped inside of a lobster pot. That next photo is our double-crested cormorant chewing on a tin can, right? And the last one is a little sanderling, right? These are shorebirds that you see running along the beach, foraging for small invertebrates in the sand. And even they have a little bit of balloon string, a little monofilament line around the feet. So that's just a few examples to show you that it's affecting a wide variety of seabirds and waterfowl. Information gaps. So this was the other section we worked on, right? We wanted to find out how it's affecting it, what we can do to help, and then what's missing, right? So this is that what's missing component. Information gap, for those of you who don't know, is a question or problem that has not been answered by any existing studies or research in a field, right? And these can exist, one, because the concept is so new and it's never been studied. They can exist because all the research you find is outdated, right? And maybe it needs to be updated. And it can also occur if a specific population is just not well studied. And I would say that the reason we have these information gaps is kind of a mix of all three, right? We found some older studies that maybe need to be updated. This is a concept, though, you know, the marine debris report is a newer concept. And again, it wasn't really Gulf of Maine specific, any of the stuff we found. So we partnered with those 80 to 90 service partners. We brought them in, we asked them, what is the biggest gaps? What are you missing? If we could provide, you know, the magic bullet for you, what would help your research to continue this study? And some examples that we came up with, they'd love to know the impacts of ghost fishing and net entanglements, right? There's no quantifiable number of how many birds we're losing. And, you know, one reason is because it's never been studied. And two is that reason we gave where, you know, if this is happening, you know, out at sea, we don't actually have a definitive number. Another would be a survey of microplastics, right? So this is plastics in the water column that can happen. And a third one is identifying these sources. Where's the debris coming from? Is it coming from tourists? Is it coming from commercial fishermen? Is it coming from recreational fishermen? So those are some gaps we worked on. Next slide. And then this is the what can we do about it, right? These are our strategies. So we came up with 3 big strategies with little bullet points in it. Number 1 is address derelict fishing gear through regulation and change and identification, right? So one way you can do that is change the regulations. Right now, it's currently illegal in all 3 Gulf of Maine states to pick up a lobster pot if it's on shore, right? So that can significantly hinder cleanup efforts on beaches because nobody wants to get a fine for cleaning up what they think is marine debris. So that's one start. We can identify these zones where gear is dumped, right? So in case a fisherman is again, it's not financially prudent for them to carry gear back with them, we need to identify those zones though. We can establish partnerships, right? So Gulf of Maine Lobster Foundation, Center for Coastal Studies, Canada's Ghost Gear Fund. These are all great partnerships that are helping U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Noaa clean up the gear because they can't do it alone. And we can teach proper gear storage, right? So when you get a fisherman's license, there's not a ton that needs to be done to be a recreational fisherman. We can increase those regulations. We can help people tie line correctly and use the right materials. Another strategy we can work on is reducing consumer litter through legislation, right? So this is lowering our usage of plastic bags and straws and single-use utensils. This is increasing NGO, which are non-governmental organizations' abilities to run these cleanups and educate the public. And then a third way is to engage community scientists. We can't collect all the data by ourselves, right? So if we can engage even half of the people at this talk today to come out and maybe clean a beach up or go do, fill out a data sheet for us, letting us know how much debris is on a beach, that all helps us. Next slide. So this is our little rundown, right? Our major types are derelict fishing gear, consumer litter, industrial litter like plastic. Our major impacts are entanglement, ingestion, and alteration of nesting habitat. Which takes us just to my last slide here, which is the framework, right? So after we collected all that information on the report, what do we do with it? How do we break it down into appropriate steps? So we hosted 3 webinar series or discussion-based webinars, a general one at the beginning, and then 2 smaller ones based on our priority strategies and information gaps. It was a really cool process because we had stakeholders from all over who normally don't sit in the same room together. And obviously we were in a Zoom room, but they were sitting together at the table discussing these problems, which is something that really hadn't been done. So this implementation framework, it targeted a problem. It broke it down into action steps. It worked on what work is already being done in those areas or what's been completed. It targeted barriers to success, which are maybe problems that might arise while working on that. And it gave everyone a first step to where to start it, right? Because if nobody gets the ball rolling, nobody raises their hand first, we're never going to get any of these things off the ground. So it did a good job targeting certain NGOs that had shown interest and really gave them something to work with. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Meg. She's going to talk a little bit about this phase 3 and how we're implementing these actions.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So yeah, that brings us up to phase 3 of the project, which was to initiate the implementation framework. This is the part of the project that I joined for and the phase that is currently underway. We started by selecting a handful of actions from the implementation framework that seemed like the lowest hanging fruit. These were actions that we thought we could easily make some progress on or had the greatest partner enthusiasm. Next slide, please. The first of these low-hanging fruit actions was to form a group of partners interested in addressing issues related to abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear. Another phrase for that is derelict fishing gear that Michael was using earlier in the presentation. And these 3 types of derelict fishing gear are typically studied together. So you may hear that phrase abandoned, lost, or discarded gear in other places. It's also a really good phrase to Google if you're interested in learning more about the subject. And just to give you an example of the concerns of our partners, this is a photo from Hart Island, which is part of the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge. It's a photo I took just a couple weeks ago. And as you can see, there is a literal wall of lobster traps, of buoys, and other debris that wraps 3/4 of the way around this island. Even on the leeward side, there's this chest-high wall of lobster pots and other debris. It's very difficult to get through because they're all twisted and tangled together. So the folks that started on the left side of the wall tended to stay on the left, and us on the right stayed on the right-hand side. It was that difficult to get around. And just on this one island, we found 10 skeletons of birds that had died entangled in these traps. So as Michael was saying, some of these birds likely entered into the traps looking for food, for protection from predators, or they were looking for a nesting site, and unfortunately they got stuck. And this is obviously an issue for folks concerned about individual animal welfare, but also for the biologists and the land managers trying to provide safe, high-quality habitat for birds and other coastal species. Next slide, please. So again, we formed this partner group to start to address some of these concerns. The goals of the group were to better understand the extent of the problem and its impacts on birds, to prioritize areas for cleanup and prevention, and to highlight the problem for legislators, the industry, the public, and to encourage a unified plan. Specifically, we wanted to know about the extent of the problem with marine debris, the quantity, and the cost to clean it up. The impacts to birds is also something we were very interested in learning about. As Michael was saying, we have entanglement, we have ingestion, and we have degradation of nesting habitat, but we don't necessarily know to what degree each of these methods is being impacted. And we also wanted to know about photos. So if people could send us photos, that would be great so that we could share information easily. So far, our partner group has met 7 times. And right from the get-go, we realized that lots of group members had these anecdotal stories or they had photos of fishing gear and its impacts on birds, but they just weren't compiled into one place and they weren't focused on the Gulf of Maine region specifically. So I tried setting up a quick data sheet to compile all this info, but I realized that the type of information that I was receiving and the type of information that people wanted varied a lot by audience. So currently we're testing out methods for compiling observations of debris at 3 different levels. The first level is for wildlife professionals, so that's a much longer, more in-depth form. The second level is for community scientists. It's another name for citizen scientists in case you're more familiar with that term. And the third is for the general public. Next slide, please. Here we have a screenshot of the form that we built for wildlife professionals. It's got quite a few questions. It's designed to take about 20 minutes to complete. And all these questions were partner driven. So each question on there represents information that we decided was important to collect as a group. And it was created using ArcGIS Online's Survey 123 program. It's a really cool program, and I know it's used by some conservation commissions and other groups with access to ArcGIS Online. So you may have seen it in use before. Overall, it's a really user-friendly tool, and it has a lot of neat features. Next slide, please. And the form is comprised of 4 main sections. The first is the introduction. So this has information about how the data are going to be used and who to call if you find injured wildlife. Next section is the background, which just has your basic information, date, location, name of observer, things like that. The third section is all about fishing gear. So this is the type of gear like trap, rope, buoy, etc. We also try to quantify the gear in this section and understand any applicable costs to clean up, whether that's actual dollars or whether it's volunteer hours. And again, we want photos of the gear. And last, we have the wildlife impact section, where people are describing the species, if they know it, if they can identify it. Sometimes it's just bones and it's really difficult to determine the species. Also the type of impact, the type of fishing gear involved, and photos of the wildlife. And overall, this form is designed to be really flexible and inclusive of different observation types. So people can record the results of a formal survey for marine debris if that's what they were doing, or they can report the results of an anecdotal sighting, and they can use whatever units of measurements, whatever types of gear, and whatever species are applicable to their location. Next slide, please. So for our community scientists, we really wanted to find a way to add a few standardized questions to some of these beach cleanup data collection forms. The problem at this point is that we have a lot of different organizations that all do cleanups, and each has developed their own system for recording and for distributing information. So some organizations don't collect any information about wildlife, or they don't try to distinguish between the different types of fishing gear, or maybe they don't have any information about who to call if an injured animal is found, etc. We'd really like to adopt something similar to the Ocean Conservancy's data collection form, which I have on the screen here, where they're asking volunteers to record whether they found a live or a dead animal and whether it was entangled or not. If so, what material was entangling it, and also just some basic categories of fishing gear. So things like, is it a lobster pot, or is it a fishing pot or trap? Is it fishing line? Is it rope, etc. Next slide, please. And lastly, we have another form for the general public, which we're hoping is much more quick and easy than some of the other longer wildlife professional forms that we developed. And this is for folks who want to report sightings of something if they happen to incidentally find an animal being impacted by gear. It's designed by Blue Ocean Society out of New Hampshire, and it's a Google form. It's got just 14 quick questions. This is a screenshot of it on your screen right now, so you can fill it out on your form, or it's simple enough that even if you just see something, you should be able to come back to your house, open up the form, and remember the answers to these simple questions. We'd like to come up with something similar to this, but potentially using the Survey 123 platform so that we can integrate the data between all of our different forms. But in the meantime, if anyone here in the audience does find an entangled shorebird or marine mammal, you can report your sighting through this form. It's available through blueoceansociety.org/wildlife survey. And I do want to stress that this is not a way to report injured wildlife to rehabbers in real time. It's just a data collection form. Next slide, please. So if you do find an injured animal in need of attention, here are some of the best resources to be able to find and to contact a wildlife rehabber. If you found a sea turtle or a marine mammal like a seal, you can visit that Noaa website, which I have on the screen here, to be connected with the right person for you. Noaa stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And you may have heard of them before. They do a lot with weather forecasting. Anyway, you can visit this website, or you can call their hotline, which I have at the top of the screen here. It's 866-755-6622. And unfortunately, if you find a bird or another type of wildlife on the shore, there isn't one quick number to call. You're going to have to find a rehabber that covers your location and the species that you found. So next slide, please, Caleb. And we found that the easiest way to find a rehabber was to visit the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife website, which I have on the screen here. You can follow the different links to find the appropriate rehabber. But there's a lot of different ways to get to the same information. So if you know of a wildlife rehabber in your area, or you have a different way of contacting someone, all of those are perfectly valid. Next slide, please. So switching gears a bit here, another action from our implementation framework that Michael had mentioned was debris from the aquaculture industry. Aquaculture refers to the growing of plants or aquatic animals for food, and this is a picture of what a farm right here in Wells, Maine looks like. Aquaculture has been occurring in Maine since at least the 1800s, but commercial leasing for aquaculture farms didn't start until the 1970s. Types of aquaculture in Maine include shellfish, so things like oysters and mussels, finfish, things like salmon and trout. Kelp and seaweed is also an industry that's on the rise. And fun fact, there's actually a few really small scale farms for sea urchins and for bait worms as well. And aquaculture is a great way to provide food without depleting wild populations of shellfish and finfish, but it does contribute to our concerns regarding marine debris. And in Maine, there are currently 874 different lease sites covering at least 1,769 acres. Each of these sites has the potential to lose equipment that contributes towards marine debris. Next slide, please. Here's just a quick look at the location of those 800 plus sites. You can see they're scattered up and down the coast. Unfortunately, the dots are really small, but those little black and purple dots that you see all along the coastline, those are all aquaculture farms. And then I also have a little inset of Wells, Maine. The red dots are where aquaculture farms are here in Wells. So you can see there's about 5 different sites. Next slide, please. A few weeks ago, we visited Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge and talked to some of the biologists there about their concerns regarding marine debris from the aquaculture industry. One of our main concerns is breakaway gear. Last year, 19 new items of gear were discovered over a period of 6 months just from these small-scale farms alone. And gear that washes into the marsh is really hard to clean up, like this image on the left here. It's often difficult to reach, and it's in the middle of salt marsh sparrow habitat, which is an at-risk species. There are also issues with intact gear resting above the mean low water line, which is considered refuge-owned land. And there's also a real lack of collaboration during the permitting process. You would think the refuge might have jurisdiction over those channels through the marsh, but they actually don't. Current law allows fouling, fishing, and navigation below mean low water. So even if the refuge owns the marsh surrounding the channel, they don't have direct control over the channel or the areas below the mean low tide line. So they don't always have a say in whether these aquaculture permits get issued. There's also a lot of unknowns about the aquaculture industry. It might have impacts on habitats, on foraging ground for birds. We wonder if it's attracting predators. Does it change water quality? And we don't know how it's really affecting the bottom substrate. Some of these types of aquaculture farms directly impact the bottom substrate, and we don't know if that has wider ranging impacts on the ecosystem. And it's possible that aquaculture doesn't significantly impact any of these systems that I just described. It might even have a positive impact. We just don't know yet. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, so far we've completed 4 meetings with U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff, and we've come up with a plan to bring the issue before our leadership. The plan involves increasing gear tagging so that we can identify which farm gear belongs to when it does wash up, to increase monitoring, and to develop a safe gear retrieval system that involves both aquaculture farmers and refuge staff. Next slide, please. So if you've listened to all this info about aquaculture debris and about fishing debris and consumer litter, and you're interested in taking action, there are several personal choices you can make. That includes things like limiting your use of disposable shopping bags, straws, and balloons, and other debris that ends up on our beaches really frequently. You can also join a formal beach cleanup event. I spoke to some folks familiar with the Wells area, and it sounds like cleanups typically happen around Earth Day. So keep an eye out for events around that time next year. You can also check out the Gulf of Maine Council's website for cleanups. That's at gulfofmaine.org/public/marine debris. This is a new feature of the website, but it's becoming more comprehensive every day, so it's worth checking out. But in general, you can keep your eyes peeled for events hosted by these groups. I have them listed on the slide, all of which have hosted cleanups in or around Wells in the past few years. This include things like the Town of Wells, the Blue Ocean Society, which again had that form that the public can use to report marine debris sightings. If anyone's interested in leading a cleanup in the Wells area, with Blue Ocean Society. There's a volunteer coordinator named Danielle. She'd love to hear from you, Danielle at blueoceansociety.org. So if you're interested, please feel free to contact her. Other groups that do cleanups that you can keep an eye out for are Surfrider Maine, Maine Coastal Program, Friends of Casco Bay, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection Healthy Beaches Program, and the Wells Reserve. I'm sure there are other groups. If you happen to know of any, you can pop them in the chat, or we can talk about them in the question and answer afterwards. There are so many different groups out there that are doing really good work. Next slide, please. If you prefer to conduct a cleanup by yourself or with friends or family, maybe due to COVID concerns or any other reason, there are also resources available that you can use to help report your findings. Blue Ocean Society has this great digital beach cleanup kit that has a lot of great info and tips about what to do before, during, and after a cleanup. It's available at blueoceansociety.org/cleanup-kit. And the only thing I would add to their guide is to be respectful of shorebird nesting areas. The best practice for cleanups is actually to stay off the beaches that have nesting shorebirds during the breeding season. And you can tell if a beach has nesting shorebirds and if it's the breeding season, because those beaches will have those signs up that say to please stay away from the nesting area and roped off areas. So if those signs are up, that means it's the breeding season. And it's generally best to stay away from those with large groups. And that typically means that fall, winter, and early spring are the best times for cleanups. If you really do want to do an independent beach cleanup during the breeding season, just be sure to stay away from those roped off areas and even the dry sand in general. Even if you see like a really shiny, enticing piece of trash that's behind those ropes, unfortunately, it is off limits to go in there. Those nests are right on the ground and they're really, really hard to see. And you also want to make sure you're not hanging up your coats or leaning your bags up against the rope. Anything that makes the materials move in the wind, or if they're just big, they can scare the adults off the nest, or you can have your gear actually blow into the roped off area, and then you can't retrieve it until the end of the breeding season. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in contributing to our data collection efforts, you can fill out that Blue Ocean Society form, or you can also contact us directly with photos or data that you'd like to share. Our emails are listed here. I'm Margaret_Harrington at fishandwildlife.gov. Caleb is Caleb_Spiegel at fishandwildlife.gov. And Michael is Michael Andranovich at gmail.com. Next slide, please. And with that, I just want to say a special thanks to the funders and the lead organizations on this project. That's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Birds Program, the Noaa Marine Debris Program, the University of Rhode Island, Rhode Island Natural History Survey, and the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And I'd also like to give our thanks to the dozens of partners who contributed to project development, to review of the report and implementation framework, and to those who provided information, insight, photos, and data. Thank you. And with that, we would be happy to take any questions. Looks like we have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you all so much for all that information. Caleb, Meg, Michael, thank you, thank you. I saw one question so far in the chat from Dina. Wondering, is it possible to get on top of all this? It's so depressing. And noting that these volunteers are angels. So I think you gave us some ideas at the end there, the cleanups. Anything else that we can do?
I gave you my easiest ideas. I didn't want to end on such a depressing note, which is why I made sure to block off a solid amount of time for all the different things that I could think of that you could do. Michael or Caleb, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I can add something, in the chat. Dina suggested that it also is those tossing the killing material into the ocean that has to be stopped. And, there are ways, there are some legislative opportunities that I've seen going around recently. One of them is there's a convention, a UN convention that is currently under development that is talking about reversing plastics into the ocean. And so look at that, look online for a little more info, or I can share that with Suzanne afterwards. But there is a current effort underway by different countries, much like the climate initiative, that is really focusing on trying to reverse plastics getting into our oceans. There's also some legislation, and actually has been legislation that has passed. I mean, one of the reasons that all this really, the Noaa Marine Debris Program was actually formed through legislative action in Congress. And so, there are opportunities to also look at the other side. Legislation is one of the possibilities that you can do. But again, you're right, it's a really challenging problem. And so we definitely need a lot of brains thinking about it, especially young people like Michael and Meg. Looks like someone might have their hand up too.
That's Mary. Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I live in Wells. I actually live off Harbor Road, and I've been cleaning up Harbor Road for over 22 years. Because we're a tourist state, there are 3 areas that I think that the public can be informed, and that is people travel up here, so gas stations, people eat up here, so restaurants, and people use facilities, the bathrooms. I was sharing this recently that I think that if the creation of placemats to be given away to any restaurant along the way, so that while people are sitting there idly, waiting for their meal, can look down at a placemat and read something of trivia and realize, oh my God, I didn't understand the magnitude of the problem and what I can do in my behavior so that it doesn't happen. At the gas stations, when people are pumping, you can have the images of the birds that have either twine wrapped around them, or you have a visual image. That would be good. And actually in the bathroom stalls, I know this kind of sounds odd, but you have someone's complete attention in there of putting up some type of bar scanning, and that directs them to information on their behavior while they're here. That's just my suggestions.
Yeah, and I can comment on that. When we were doing the implementation framework, we talked about creating those partnerships with NGOs and nonprofits, right? And really starting with the restaurants and the recreation, right? The people who lead sailing classes and fishermen. And I think that there's a lot of good movement right now towards increasing those partnerships, especially to get the education component out there. So.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, that there are a number of different groups, as Meg started talking about, and actually there's someone on the call, Joan LeBlanc, is coordinating a project for the Gulf of Maine Council too. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Joan, but there are a number of different folks that are working on both within the state of Maine and also beyond, are working on trying to get some of these coordination efforts going. And again, as far as the bird idea, yeah, I think it's really important to link some of the images that are powerful. They tell, an image tells 1,000 words, and that's one of the things that I think we can do with merging some of this wildlife impact information into some of these efforts that are going on from partners in the Gulf of Maine.
I see, let's see, a note here to please be sure to coordinate any requested access to Rachel Carson lands via our office due to the sensitive habitats and animals, with an invitation to call the office and join their volunteer list. And let's see, Dina, the Ocean Conservancy sent a survey recently. Do they make a difference?
Yeah, the Oceans Conservancy was a partner on our project, and Michael just gave us thumbs up. But I think that I can also reiterate that yes, it would be good to answer that survey. They are very active in the marine cleanup, and they also provide a lot of information about just what's out there washing up on the beaches. So I would say, yeah, absolutely, answer that survey.
And Joan, your hand's up. Go ahead, Joan.
Yeah, thanks. Just really quick, I wanted to follow up on Mary's comment. Totally agree, Mary. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head that awareness is key to moving forward with solving any of the issues here. So I just want to say thank you to Caleb and Meg and all the partners, because the work you've done on trying to understand the impact of marine debris on birds is so helpful in getting people to understand why marine debris is an issue and why it's important to make a difference. So just thanks to you guys, because I think you're doing so much even more than you presented today. And we look forward to continuing to work in partnership with you. And if you weren't out there talking about the problem and its scope, which I do understand can be a little depressing, but at the same time, it provides an opportunity to be proactive on some really important elements here. So great job, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan.
I think we have one more question from Barbara, and then we can wrap things up. Go ahead, Barbara.
Suzanne, it's not a question, but summer camps. All the younger attendees of our many summer camps in Maine came to my mind. Maybe a basic info could be sent to summer camps to convey this. And I agree with the images of trapped animals and birds is really bringing it home. So thank you very much for an incredible program. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks very much. And one thing I can say, just to follow up on that, Barbara, as far as the summer camps, Michael, coordinates AmeriCorps programs, and those guys have a lot of young folks, not necessarily summer camps, but young folks that are wanting to do something productive. And so, kudos to Michael and the AmeriCorps program and other programs like that get kids and young adults really focused on conservation action and getting out there and making a difference.
Well, this has been very informative, and I really appreciate you doing this. I'll help in any way, so just, let me know when.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Mary. And thanks to everyone in the audience for your participation and your great questions and comments and suggestions. And to Caleb, Meg, and Michael for your amazing presentation. We all learned so much.
Absolutely, yes.
It's a great call to action for all of us.